Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Unfolding Geopolitics. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Raghav Sharma, who is a professor and the director of the Center for Afghanistan Studies at the School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University. Dr. Sharma is the author of Nation, Ethnicity, and the Conflict in Afghanistan. He also regularly writes media commentaries on Afghanistan. His current research project critically examines the relationship between the Afghan Taliban and the state of Pakistan, which makes him the perfect guest for our today's conversation, which is on the ongoing conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which has been going on for several months. So, Pakistan and Afghanistan share one of the world's most volatile borders, and for decades, these two countries maintain an uneasy relationship. Pakistan was actually one of the few nations that backed the Afghan Taliban when they first came in power in the 1990s, but that relationship has collapsed dramatically. On October 9, 2025, Pakistan launched airstrikes inside Afghanistan targeting the leadership of the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, and a retaliatory strikes was followed thereafter. Pakistan's defense minister also declared that these two countries are now at an open war. A brief ceasefire was brokered, but the fighting has continued ever since. So today we're trying to understand what is really happening on the ground, who are the actors, and where this is headed with Dr. Sharma.
Thank you for having me, Ravina.
Okay, let's start. So, Dr. Sharma, let's start with a big picture. This conflict didn't come out of nowhere. There's been years of tension, a TTP insurgency, cross border militant activity, but Pakistan had been absorbing TTP attacks for years without striking Afghan soil at this scale. But on October 9th, 2025, it felt like a turning point. What actually happened, and would you call what we're seeing right now a war or something else? What was the breaking point? Why did Islamabad decide to strike Kabul directly in October 2025, and what did they hope to achieve?
Well, it's important to have some context essentially for this escalation. It's actually a classic case of the chickens having come back home to roost, so to speak. If you go back to August 2021, Pakistan very emphatically had welcomed the Taliban's
Mhm.
victory over Kabul. And this, as time has shown over the last nearly 5 years that the Taliban have been in power, this has proven to be a Pyrrhic victory for Pakistan. Right? And this should not surprise us because if we go back to the period of the 1990s, Pakistan experienced something very similar, which is instead of Pakistan acquiring strategic depth in Afghanistan, a plethora of Islamist groups jockeyed to acquire reverse strategic depth in Pakistan, right? Groups like the ones led by Sufi Muhammad. So Pakistan was expecting different results while experimenting with the same formula, so to speak. And therefore, what we have seen since August 2021, that is, since the Taliban returned to power, a secular increase in TTP attacks. There's been a year-on-year increase in TTP attacks, and this is borne out by the number of civilian casualties, the number of security personnel who've been killed, but also the number of militants who've been killed. Levels of violence are at their highest since 2015. And what we have seen is that, you know, this is proven that this is a Pyrrhic victory. It's also punctured the discourse Pakistan had long peddled that heavy Indian presence during 20 years of the Republic was being used to foment trouble in Pakistan. So it really has punctured that entire discourse, so to speak. Now, this specific attack in October 2025 was triggered by a large-scale attack that led to the death of, I think, 11 security personnel in Pakistan. Um, um, and that had come after ceasefire negotiations that had been mediated by Qatar and Turkey that had broken down effectively. And this eventually led Pakistan to retaliate and carry out airstrikes, which interestingly, came against the backdrop of the Taliban's very conscientious effort to shore up ties with India. Their interim foreign minister was in a visit to New Delhi when these strikes took place, which has also allowed Pakistan to once again prop up the narrative that it's India which is actually using Afghanistan as a proxy battleground to settle scores with Pakistan. And Pakistan hoped essentially that through these airstrikes is going to send out a number of messages. One is going to deter possibly future attacks and signal to the TTP and to their backers in Kabul that any attacks that the TTP carries out essentially are going to have costs, right? And Pakistan is free to take kinetic action, essentially in response to the attacks that it attributes to groups like the TTP. They also hoped that by targeting military installations of the Afghan Taliban, they'll be able to wear down whatever military capability that the Afghan Taliban possesses in forms of, military bases, in forms of, the American cache of arms that they have access to. So they're hoping that this would also wear down the Taliban militarily. It will degrade their capability essentially, and it will coerce the Taliban to eventually act in some credible way against the TTP and rein them in and deny them safe sanctuary. But what it has done, certainly in effect, is it has reinforced at a popular level anti-Pakistan sentiment across Afghanistan in very pronounced ways. It has allowed the Taliban essentially to rally people around the flag as it seeks to, issue calls for unity to take on what it calls Pakistani aggression. Third, the Afghan Taliban has sought to use these attacks to shore up their domestic legitimacy and ward off, a long-running label that they found very hard to shed, which is that they're proxies of the generals in Rawalpindi, and they have actually tried to use these attacks to underscore that look, we are not proxies of the generals in Pindi. They're attacking us primarily because we are doing what we believe is good for the national interests of the Afghan state. So Pakistan has not achieved essentially the objectives it wanted to achieve, because had it done so, we would not have seen a recurrence essentially of violence, a recurrence of tensions with the Afghan Taliban, which have carried over well into 2026. And interestingly, this also comes at a very volatile point in time. There's turmoil in the Middle East. Pakistan is dealing with tensions with its border with India. It is also seeing escalating levels of violence in Balochistan, where separatist groups like the BLA, for instance, have dramatically stepped up their attacks. So if you actually pick up empirical data coming out from Pakistan itself, the highest levels of violence are in KPK. And
Oh, Dr. Sharma, you talked about the proxies and also Balochistan Liberation Army who have stepped up their attacks and their strategies. So from the outside, Pakistan appears to be fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Afghan Taliban and the TTP in the western border and the BLA in the south. Are these connected or are these separate conflicts that Islamabad is feeling at the same time? And does this pressurizes and affects Pakistan's strategy in any way?
that's an interesting and a very relevant question. Look, the Baloch insurgency is much older than the TTP. The Baloch and the TTP insurgencies came up in very different contexts. The Baloch insurgency has had many phases from the late 1940s onwards. The latest sort of round of fighting against the Pakistani state gained a lot of momentum post the assassination of Nawab Akbar Khan Bugti by the Pakistani state. The TTP, in contrast, is a relatively younger organization that came up in the context of NATO intervention in Afghanistan. They also have very different aims. The Baloch are a secular nationalist, rather ethno-nationalist grouping with an aim to secede from the state of Pakistan and exert control over their both political destiny, but also their own natural resources and redress a lot of the grievances that they have against the Pakistani state. The TTP, in contrast, aspires to have a state that is governed by Sharia law, and they don't have a secessionist agenda. They simply want to overturn the existing socio-political order in Pakistan and they want to capture the state to re-engineer society and polity from the top. So their aims and objectives are different. The context in which these insurgencies were born are very different. Yet what we have seen is that from about 2006 onwards, there has been an attempt by the TTP to try and make inroads into Balochistan.
Mhm.
2014 onwards, they issued calls for the Baloch to join the ranks of the TTP. They've been using from about 2021, 2022, so the period that largely overlaps with the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan. They've used that period to amplify calls to join ranks with the TTP. They are not only now calling on the Baloch to join the TTP, but they are also supporting a lot of the grievances that the Baloch have against the Pakistani state. They, have expressed sympathy essentially for the Baloch to not only exercise control over their natural resources, but to find redressal for their grievances pertaining to enforced disappearances. And they're calling on the Baloch to join the fight against what they see as an oppressive, or what they like to brand as an oppressive Pakistani state. Um, 2022, 2023 onwards, what we've seen, again, the evidence is very sketchy in the public domain, but there's been some level of collaboration, at least at tactical level, between the Baloch insurgents and the TTP. There are at least about four Baloch insurgent groups that have, joined ranks with the TTP, minus the PLA, which is the largest, the most well-known, well-armed group. But what is noticeable is that none of the Baloch groups, including the BLA, have opposed or even given any pronounced statement on the expansion of the TTP and its activities into Balochistan, right? Which shows that there is probably some level of operational and tactical cooperation between the two, because the two essentially are interested to stretch the Pakistani forces thin by ramping up attacks in both KPK and Balochistan. They are well aware that the Pakistani forces are stretched thin because there's also been a build-up of tensions with India over the past. So they're keen essentially to capitalize on that. Also, for the Baloch insurgents, alliance with the TTP not only helps in terms of stretching the Pakistani forces thin and ramping up attacks, but it also could give them access to training. It can give them access to American arms cache, and it can also help the Baloch to move their fighters into Afghanistan, where the TTP have sympathizers for a variety of reasons. So again, evidence is sketchy. There are ideological differences. The two are born in very different contexts, but there is, what available evidence points to is that there is some level of tactical cooperation between the two, even though the end goal for the two may not be the same. Ideologically, they're not really co-travelers, so to speak.
Yes.
So Pakistan finds itself in a fairly precarious position militarily. It is a bit stretched.
So, in your perspective, who's faring better military right now? Because you just said that, it's a little stretched. But Pakistan has a professional army and an air force. But Afghanistan, despite having no formal international recognition and a collapsing economy, it seems to be holding its ground just fine. So, how do you assess the military balance? What gives Afghan Taliban the ability to sustain this?
Clearly, in the conventional sense of the term, Pakistan has the obvious military edge. It has an air force. It has
Hmm.
a system, both of which are lacking in the Afghan case. The Air Force has practically collapsed for all practical purposes post the fall of the Republic. They don't really have an air defense system to speak of.
Right.
And, the size of the Afghan army under the Afghan Taliban is much smaller. It's dwarfed by the Pakistani army, which is, it's a professional standing army with years of experience in dealing with counterinsurgency.
Mhm.
Having said that, and we've seen that the Pakistanis, both in 2025 and 2026, have shown that they possess the ability to strike at will where and when they want. So they can choose the timing and the scale of kinetic action that they want to initiate against the Afghan Taliban. But having said that, what we should bear in mind is that the Taliban, it's an ideological movement. It's a movement that has had a 20-year experience in fighting NATO, which is
Mm.
comprised of army men deployed from perhaps the most well-resourced armies in the world, including the United States. And they were able, for a variety of reasons, they were able essentially to get the better of them. Um, they therefore can resort to, over a long period of time, if push comes to shove, they have the ability to resort to low-scale guerrilla warfare, which can be fairly bloody for Pakistan. More than
Mm.
that, I mean, more than resorting to guerrilla warfare, what they also have is the ability to unleash suicide bombers, right?
Right.
Which would infiltrate not just from Afghanistan into Pakistan, but they have a fairly active network within Pakistan, which, if
Mm.
activated, could actually suck both the countries down into a fairly bloody conflict spiral. And the third thing which has come up is that they've, not shied away from using drones. Right. And again, the Afghan Taliban are not the only ones who've been doing this. They've been observing very carefully what the Iranians have been up to
Mm.
over this long running conflict they've had in the Middle East. And they have used these drones, although not to the same effect, but they're studying that very closely. So essentially, they have the capability in the long run to afflict costs on the Pakistani state and Pakistani society by unleashing suicide bombers, by using drones, but also by ramping up ideological indoctrination, right, which is a fairly
Mm.
pronounced but yet underrated challenge, so to speak. So Pakistan, will also pay costs in the long run, even though in the short run they may seem to sort of hold sway. And the fact that the Middle East has been in turmoil for the last 2 to 3 months also limits the ability of these Middle Eastern countries to mediate this conflict in the manner that they had done in 2025. Right. So the area of diplomatic options is also limited for Pakistan.
What I understand is Afghanistan has more leverage than Pakistan. I mean, even though it doesn't have a large army like Pakistan, but it does have drones, it has better military tactics, so it's doing much better than Pakistan.
Drones, I wouldn't say necessarily better military tactics. It has, as I said, the ability, it has, battle-hardened fighters who fought a 20-year-long insurgency, right? And
Hmm.
they have a lot of experience in the terrain that Pakistan is fighting in as well.
Hmm.
They know how essentially to mount suicide attacks, use IEDs, which were absolutely lethal for the NATO while they were in Afghanistan. Plus, they're deeply embedded in local networks, which gives them an added advantage vis-a-vis the Pakistani state. Because, I mean, we have to keep in mind the fact there are grievances, genuine grievances against the Pakistani state in the local tribal areas, and that is, played out in two ways. One is that it's galvanized to a certain extent groups like the TTP, which has played on local grievances, but it's also led to mobilization in the form of the PTM, which has got very little coverage. And these people are essentially protesting against enforced disappearances, collateral damage, quote unquote, that has come about as a consequence of Pakistan's kinetic actions in not just Afghanistan, but the tribal areas to flush out, people who are not pliable to the Pakistani state. So there are genuine grievances, and they've capitalized on that fairly well. So, they have the capability, in other words, to inflict costs, even though on the military front, the dice may appear loaded in favor of Pakistan for now, but they have the capability to wage asymmetric warfare.
So, do they have any international support?
Well, what we've seen is that the Afghan Taliban may be isolated in the sense that it's only recognized by one country. Afghan Taliban, they've invited calls for mediation from international actors, but no country has really condemned the Afghan Taliban for what is played out with the Pakistanis over the last couple of months since
Mm.
2025. There've been concerns that countries have, raised with regards to the
Right.
terrorists, not specifically the TTP. So they have actually managed to salvage the situation diplomatically because they've not really been jasticized in any
Mm.
meaningful way. In fact, if you look at the reports that came in when mediation efforts were underway in 2025, unofficially, the diplomats, even from the Middle East, were very critical of the Pakistani delegation and their attitude towards mediation efforts, and not they were not really critical so much of the Afghan Taliban. They said it's the Pakistani negotiators who are making things really, really difficult. So they have actually, done fairly well in managing the situation at a diplomatic level, so to speak.
Dr. Sharma, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia signed a defense pact last year, but so far Saudi Arabia has not visibly stepped in. Meanwhile, as you mentioned, that it was Qatar and Turkey who brokered the ceasefire and not China, even though they have enormous economic leverage over both Islamabad and Kabul. So, what's going on diplomatically? Is China sitting back or is it quietly supporting either side? And what is Saudi Arabia's actual position here?
Countries like Saudi, even Qatar at the moment, they've been all
Hmm.
sucked up. Their diplomatic and geopolitical energies have all been sucked up by the war in the Middle East, right? So this is really a sideshow for them because they have far larger stakes in terms of what's been happening vis-a-vis the conflict between Iran and the United States and Israel, because that has a direct bearing on their security. So they are really stretched to the hilt, and they've therefore not been so involved in the latest conflagration that has played out since March 2026 between the Afghans and the Pakistanis. Interestingly, you mentioned China. So while it's true that the Chinese sort of sat it out in the first round, in the second round, interestingly, while Pakistan was sort of pitching itself as a mediator in the Iran war, to the Trump administration, Pakistan itself was soliciting the services of Beijing to thrash out differences essentially with the Afghan Taliban. And the Chinese actually hosted a Afghan and a Pakistani delegation in the city of Urumqi to get dialogue going between the two sides. And basically, all they could get the two to agree on was that they'd continue talking. But there was no ceasefire. There was no agreement that they came up with. In fact, what we see is that, around the 28th of April, 2026 onwards, there was a renewed round of hostilities triggered by Pakistan bombing Asadabad, which is the capital of Kunar province, with actually there being no clear trigger point as to why Pakistan did that. So the Chinese essentially did try to step in, late March, without much success. The Pakistanis, I'm told, are not too thrilled about the kind of role that the Chinese have gone on to acquire, because if you look at what has transpired since August 2021, is that the Chinese have had the maximum number of bilateral engagements with the Afghan Taliban. Pakistan is at a distant fifth or sixth. And this is very telling because in the 90s, the Chinese, while they never had any official links with the Taliban, they had one of the best unofficial working relationships with the Afghan Taliban, thanks to the ISI. Today, the roles have flipped to the extent that, the ISI was keeping the door open for them. Today, the Chinese are mediating between the Afghans and the Pakistanis. The Chinese essentially are not interested for this conflagration to play out and, sort of stretch out over the long run. And that is not because, Afghanistan holds any special place for them. They are not interested so much in terms of who governs Afghanistan and what happens there. But what they are concerned about is that any instability from Afghanistan has the potential to spill over and possibly suck in Pakistan, and it could spill over into neighboring Central Asia, where the Chinese have both huge investments and interests at stake. So they don't want that instability essentially to spill over, and that's what's been driving the Chinese to try and get the two to iron out their differences. But what this latest round of negotiations has shown is that while China wields influence, it wields the economic leverages. It has offered to the Afghans that we'll, weld you into the BRI initiative. There are economic takeaways for you that are hard to resist. But what it does show is that there are limitations to these economic leverages, right? It does not necessarily translate into policy outcomes of the kind that a state may desire. So while they may be real economic leverages, they've not got the Taliban to change their course on giving sanctuary to the TTP or to shed some of their ideological positions on how they see the world. So there are limitations essentially to that.
Lastly, I would like to ask you India's position in this conflict. As we haven't taken any formal position so far, but India and Afghanistan have historically had warm ties. And Pakistan, under pressure, is not really entirely against India's strategic interests. So, what is India's real position here? And is there a role India can or should be playing?
India, as we've seen, has issued vociferous statements at an official level. If you look at the EMA press briefings, you look at some of the proceedings of the UN Security Council, India's been fairly vociferous in condemning Pakistan's airstrikes on civilians. Now, while it's good that we've condemned the airstrikes on civilians, this makes for a very stark contrast with India's deafening silence when it comes to access to education for girls. When it comes to the Taliban's domestic policies, there's been deafening silence. So it makes for a very jarring contrast. And again, India is the norm. It's not the exception. Most of the states around the world, including countries of the European Union that were on the model high horse, have their rhetoric essentially on all of this is petered out, and that is because all states are in a transactional relationship with the Afghan Taliban. But I think while it's fine to condemn attacks on civilians, I think we should not get too involved in the conflagration between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that is because we don't want to give credence, or we should not be seen as giving credence to claims that the Pakistanis have been advancing. That look, we told you so. The Indians are using the Taliban as a proxy, and they're using Afghanistan as a proxy battleground to settle scores with us. Right? That doesn't go in our interest. Right? It also makes for a very jarring contrast with the fact that while we say that we condemn civilian casualties and we talk to people ties, then we don't issue visas to the Afghans, even for education and medicine. So I think we have to be very cautious in terms of what kind of approach we take. There's very little leverage that we have with either side essentially to mediate the conflict. So I think what we should be looking at is to see how we can play this to our advantage, to build on existing set of ties. What are the areas of intervention that the conflict opens up for us? For instance, it's led to a lot of displacement, internal displacement in Afghanistan. And there's been a lot of demand essentially for India to rekindle a lot of its development initiative projects in Afghanistan. Pakistan has forcefully repatriated millions of Afghans. Its shelling has dislocated many Afghans. So there is a huge humanitarian crisis brewing. So where is it that we can step in? Because that is what eventually created large constituencies of goodwill. What we've also seen is the conflict with Pakistan has disrupted trade to a very significant extent. We shouldn't forget that Pakistan was one of the largest trading partners alongside Iran of the Afghans. And And what has happened is that because of border tensions with Pakistan and because of the conflict in Iran, border trade essentially has been disrupted, causing huge losses to Afghan traders. It's also led to losses to the Afghan treasury. About 40% of the Afghan government revenue came from customs revenue, right? So that revenue stream has been disrupted. So what is it that we can do essentially to build capacities to help the Afghans find alternative markets to support livelihoods? I think these are the areas of intervention that we should be focusing on, and we shouldn't let the theatrics essentially distract us from pursuing our larger goals.
Yeah, that is very interesting, Jay, Dr. Sharma. Do you have any final remarks on this discussion and on this topic? How do you see this conflict will evolve in coming months?
Well, I frankly don't think that this is going to sort of, go away anytime soon. What we should be mindful of is the fact that, Afghanistan and Pakistan are neighbors, right? Pakistan is going to be, it's going to be around and exercise influence and leverage over Afghanistan in a way that we will not be able to because of a lack of geographical contiguity. The Pakistanis have economic and ethnic ties, and therefore, their presence is something we'll have to contend with. We should also keep in mind the fact that, no situation between neighbors is ever a constant. So one shouldn't get too carried away with what is happening at the moment. We should really try and focus, I would say, on the larger picture, so to speak, in order to secure our interests. And theatrics and rhetoric really shouldn't distract us from that goal. Also, we should keep in mind the fact that the Taliban-Pakistan relationship is not a black and white relationship. It is not a classic patron-client relationship either. There's always been some give and take. There are some issues on which the Taliban and the Pakistani state have happily collaborated, and there are other core issues on which the Taliban have refused to cede ground, be it the Durand Line or be it, the issue of the TTP, because it is an ideological movement. It's not a classic, political party that has come to power merely with a different ideology. It's a very different kind of political animal. This is something we ought to bear in mind when looking at these realities. And third, the third thing we ought to be aware of is the fact that this is also a very changed context. It's a context in which the Taliban are far more diplomatically engaged. Pakistan is not their only lifeline to the world. But this is also a period where we've seen China's footprint grow, not just in Afghanistan, but in many parts of India's neighborhood. So we cannot take, the rhetoric of people-to-people ties, goodwill for India, etc., for granted. Right? We are operating in very different realities, in very complex realities.
It was indeed a very insightful discussion, and I think you also gave some suggestions that how India can leverage the situation by enhancing trade, diplomatic efforts, visa resumptions, and also helping in their livelihood. So thank you so much for joining in, Dr. Sharma.